Good evening. My name is Nancy Kegan Smith, and I'd like to welcome you as FLAIR's Vice President to tonight's program. Thank you to our partner, American University School of Public Affairs, who has been so supportive of our endeavor. And to our FLAIR institutional members, Rider University, White House Historical Association, Massachusetts Historical Society, the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation, and our two newest institutional members, the National First Ladies Library and the Center for Presidential History at Southern Methodist University. Our program tonight is called Taking a New Look at Edith Wilson, and should be a fascinating discussion of Edith's influence on the role of First Lady. The panel moderator is Dr. Katherine Sibley, Professor of History and Director of American Studies at St. Joseph's University. Panelists in order, I think, are Dr. Mary Stockwell, retired Professor of History and Department Chair at Lord's University, who writes on the American West, 20th century politics, and especially Woodrow Wilson. Our second panelist will be Rebecca Roberts, Curator of Programming at Planet Word, a museum of words and language in Washington, D.C. And our third panelist will be Dr. Stacy Cordery, who holds the Dennis and Vaughn Johnson Endowed Chair in Theodore Roosevelt Studies at Dickinson University in North Dakota. Phew! More biographic information on each panelist is available on the FLAIR website at flair-net.org. We will be taking questions at the end of the program, which should be emailed to firstladies2021@gmail.com. Now, with great pleasure, I turn over the program to my friend and scholar, Dr. Katherine Sibley.
Thank you so much, Nancy. What a lovely introduction of our exciting panel this evening. And it's so lovely to have you all here. Thank you so much for coming. And it is my great pleasure to open up with our first presenter, who is Dr. Mary Stockwell. And I'm so excited to hear what she has to say about Edith Wilson. Thank you all.
Thank you. My slides, there they are. Oh, thank you so much. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks for everyone at FLAIR. Thanks also to the Rosie, the support, technical support. Thank you. Let me say, I wish I could say a lot about Edith Wilson, but what I want to do tonight is simply to kind of give you some of my overview, my first insights, and then make three points about her that I have found fascinating. Next, please. I don't know if you have had this experience about Edith Wilson, but when I talk to her about people that I'm writing about her or Woodrow Wilson, I often get hit with a negative response. I say she's got what I call negative charisma. There are some people in history who, no matter what you do, you can't quite bring them out of darkness. They seem to be always, there's something there that's mysterious and dark. I've got to mention Alexander Hamilton, one of my favorite people when I was growing up. People thought terribly of him. No matter what you said, you couldn't say anything nice about Hamilton. Thanks to Lin-Manuel Miranda, who's brought him out of the darkness now, and he's a great hero in America. But unless Edith gets a musical, I don't know if it will ever happen for her. Here's what people tell me. She was a femme fatale. She lured Wilson into a second marriage when his wife was barely dead. She was a Lady Macbeth behind the throne, manipulating him when he had his stroke. I hear more now that she was a racist, a family of slaveholders, a lover of Robert E. Lee, and she was anti-feminist because she didn't want a constitutional amendment for women to have the right to vote. Next, please. What I've discovered is a much more complex Edith Wilson. I wrote a book on Woodrow Wilson for a series on the presidents. I discovered a Wilson I didn't know, very romantic, very emotional, very deep feeling. I'm discovering who Edith really is. I'm working with Molly on her book on First Lady's memoirs. Her memoir is fascinating. And that third picture there on the right, I've been to the Library of Congress and I've read her papers, especially Edith's papers when she was trying to put this memoir together. And I've learned a lot from all of this. Next, please. All right, my first point. You can't understand Edith Wilson if you don't understand Woodrow Wilson's attitude towards women. This is a very sensitive topic now. If I say Wilson and women, most people will say, like that wonderful picture I found, he's Kaiser Wilson. He was against the constitutional amendment giving the women the right to vote, at least for a long time when he was president. This makes you think that Wilson is a kind of dour figure who hates women, doesn't want them to succeed, has nothing to do with them or nothing good to say about them. But I've discovered nothing can be farther from the truth. I can't think of another president for whom women were so important. They were his advisors, his counselors, from the time he was a little boy with his mother all the way up through having wives and children. He looked at women as intelligent, supportive, and he needed their, not just their adoration, not their support, but he needed them working with him when he was a student, when he was a professor, and then when he was president. Next, please. This is just a short list of the women who played a key role in his life, from his mother all the way up through Edith. The Wilson who comes through in most of his biographies is, again, dour, dark. Sigmund Freud wrote a horrible portrait of him as a woman-hating, kind of a man-worshipping person. Again, nothing could be farther from the truth. All of these people in his life mattered to him, and he turned to women for counsel, help, support, and especially once he was president, both of his wives, first Ellen and then Edith, were closer to him than, I have to say, they were advisors. They were helpmates. This might be a stretch, but sometimes I think of them the way maybe Valerie Jarrett was in the White House helping Obama. They did a lot more than the typical things you would think a woman should do in that position. And that includes, again, being a supporter, helping with speeches, even helping make policy decisions. And Edith is going to fit right into this need and this love Wilson has of women. Next, please. When she becomes the first lady, she does, again, it happens right after Wilson's wife has died. He meets her through his doctor. She's brought into the White House. She's a Washington widow, to help Margaret Wilson and help Helen Bones, the cousin, who are brokenhearted. Wilson falls in love with her, and immediately, even before they're married, she begins to help him. I'm not saying make policy decisions, but she listens to his trouble, she listens to his speeches, and she begins to help him crafting a lot of his ideas. The two amazing things she will do when she's in the White House, the first one is she's the decoder. She will decode and code all the secret messages going back and forth to Europe in World War I. And she will also handle a thing called the box. Wilson put all of his papers from everybody who needed a decision in a box on his desk. At night, he'd read through them, he'd type up his answers. She was right there with him. Again, she always said, I didn't formulate policy, but he certainly bounced ideas off of me. Next, please. It's October 1919, Wilson has a stroke and the nation is in a crisis. These are the men I could think of who were in a crisis of either illness or assassination. And they had a few days, a few weeks, a few hours to live. I also thought of Zachary Taylor, who had 5 days to live. Nobody had really been in a position like Wilson where he was mentally totally sound from a stroke, but he was physically weak. What should have been done? Think of yourself, you be Edith Wilson, and you try to figure out what would you do at this time. What if you were Wilson's daughters? What if Wilson had had a son and something like this had happened? What should have been done to help this president? Next, please. She makes a decision. She makes a decision and this is the second thing I've discovered about her, she takes on the role of chief of staff. Her role of chief of staff is almost identical to the definition of chief of staff that you can find in Chris Whipple's book, The Gatekeeper, where he shows how H.R. Haldeman created this role in Nixon's presidency. That's exactly what Edith Wilson was doing 50 years before. It's Wilson's doctors who encourage her to continue doing what she did before, sitting with Wilson and helping him make decisions, or just watching him make decisions. She decided, yes, I'll do what they're recommending. Everything will come to me first. If it's something that a department or senator can decide, I'll send it back. If Wilson must decide it, I will type it up in a tabloid form. I'll show it to him. He'll make the decision. I'll make sure the decision is implemented. Again, she never used the term gatekeeper. She never used the term chief of staff. But when you read her against what's coming 50 years down the road, that's exactly what she did. Next, please. Next. Okay. Why did she do it? To save her husband. Did her doctors tell her if he has something to live for, meaning the presidency, he'll survive. But she also believed completely in his agenda, which was to stop Republicans like Henry Cabot Lodge, who were out to destroy both what he wanted on an international stage and a national stage. They lost the fight for the League of Nations. They lost the fight for the Treaty of Versailles, but they tried. And she also said he made two more important decisions that are forgotten when she was a chief of staff. He stopped all leases for oil on government land. He said that's going to lead to corruption, which it does in the next presidency. He also vetoed the Volstead Act. He didn't want prohibition. His decision was overridden, but he kept trying to do the progressive things he thought were necessary, things like keeping the doors of immigration open. And she said, if I can serve in this position to help him win his agenda, then that's what I'll do. Next, please. I would recommend to historians, don't just look at Edith Wilson, don't just look at H.R. Haldeman, who will come up with a real chief of staff position. Look at people in the next 50 years who did a similar thing to her and judge her against them or evaluate her very creative role she played against them. There was another woman under FDR who acted as a chief of staff, again, de facto, informal, and that's Missy LeHand, especially in his second term. She was a gatekeeper. She helped to push so much legislation through, but we think of her, okay, 2 minutes, I see it. We often think of her as well. She was, this is what she wore, this was her dress. Wasn't she a bubbly person? No, she was a chief of staff. Next, please. It might be a stretch, but there was a relative in the future who stepped in a crisis to act as an acting chief of staff. That was Robert Kennedy, who stepped in after the Bay of Pigs and became the real gatekeeper and counselor, somebody JFK could trust, performing a similar role to what Edith did. Next, please. I think the person she was most like, I would compare to Admiral William Leahy, especially in FDR's final year in office. FDR was sick, much sicker than Wilson was, and he helps make major decisions about the presidents for the president in that critical final year of office. Again, doing the same thing informally. He's considered a great hero, but Edith is often suspect for what she did. Next, please. My final thing, I'll wrap this up fast. She dismisses everything she does. She dismisses it. I didn't do anything that important. I didn't do anything that critical. I just stepped in like maybe any wife would, any first lady would. No, she created a role which is going to become much more important as the 20th century goes on. Historians have dismissed her. I learned about this dismissal. See that writing tablet? She filled up writing tablet after writing tablet with her memoirs, and out of that will come her autobiography. Next, please. And in her autobiography, she's under immense pressure to prove her femininity. This is the most shocking thing I learned about all the kind of the publicity materials for a publisher. You keep saying you're feminine. You keep saying you're just a good, sweet woman. To be chief of staff, you got to be tough. So she's always in this position of denying what she did, we still, I think as historians, follow that instead of saying, what did she do to be a real leader at a critical time in American history? Next, please. My 2 final slides. I began to realize that there's a rhetoric to the chief of staff position. And I learned this because, again, I'm working with Molly, who was a professor of rhetoric, and she's putting together this great book on First Ladies' memoirs. And I read Chris Whipple's book again. There's a big book on William Leahy, the big Peter Baker's book on James Baker, all chiefs of staff. And I began to hear this, that it's a manly job for a manly man looking for a manly president. And aren't all these guys great because they're such men, like linebackers protecting a quarterback, or like bouncers throwing drunks out of a bar. This damages then our view of Edith, because she has to be a woman. She has to be just a first lady, that she stepped in the breach of a terrible tragedy and kept Wilson's presidency going at least for a year. I think if she was a man, she'd be admired for it. I keep saying if she had been Thomas Woodrow Wilson Jr., there'd probably be great books about her right now. Maybe we can someday get past that idea that a chief of staff is a manly thing, and we see it as a position of helping the president. My last slide, please. This is a famous picture. I've always seen it, and when historians write critically about her, that she was this Lady Macbeth behind the throne, kind of telling the drooling Woodrow Wilson what to do. This is in her memoir. She was proud of this picture. She said, no, this is me. This is 1920. I like to think he's vetoing the Volstead Act right now. She thought of it as this helpmate, but still there's that quality of she shouldn't have been doing this person behind the throne. Next, please. Take a look at this picture. We would never, ever think anything negative about James Baker. James Baker, James Baker, in his role as chief of staff for Reagan and I think the Bushes, he was there to help, not to in any way get in the way of Reagan. He was in there to make sure that his agenda was fulfilled, and that he was the gatekeeper to do that. My theory is Edith was the first to, whether you think she should do it or shouldn't have, whether we will see her like again, probably not, with the 25th Amendment and the Anti-Nepotism Act, but she was a much more important person maybe than we give her credit for being.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that really enlightening presentation. And now it is my pleasure, and keep your questions in your heads, because you'll get a chance to ask some questions later on. Now it is my great pleasure to introduce Rebecca Roberts, who will continue our discussion of Edith Wilson. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I will say I came to Edith Wilson. I've got a biography of her coming out next year because I've written a couple of books about suffrage. And whenever I gave talks about suffrage, people asked me about Edith. There is some narrative out there that maybe she was whispering in Wilson's ear to make him finally, reluctantly support the 19th Amendment, which is totally untrue. She was, as Mary said, against federal suffrage. But there is this notion out there that she was, you can call her Lady Macbeth, some kind of manipulative power behind the throne. And if you don't think that of her, you think she is this sort of country bumpkin who didn't have much education, who won the president's heart because she was so pretty, who had no business holding the power that she did when Wilson had a stroke. And let's be clear, she did have no business holding that power, right? No one elected Edith to anything. And whether she did it well or not, it's still, or whether she had good intentions or not, it was still unconstitutional and probably not the best thing for the office of the presidency. But as Mary said, one of the reasons I think everyone is so surprised that this lovely little Edith Wilson took on a role like that is that she very much wanted it that way. She cultivated this image of herself as this extremely feminine, extremely background person who was just doing everything she could to support her very brilliant husband. And her memoir, while fascinating, is not always true. She says some things or embroiders some things or leaves some things out that are demonstrably wrong. And so she very, very much curated her image as this feminine helpmeet as opposed to as a strong, ambitious person. So we could all be forgiven for getting her wrong. But the truth is, if you do just a little tiny bit of research into Edith, you shouldn't be surprised by what she did in 1919 at all. She telegraphed over and over and over again what kind of a person she was. Starting from her childhood in Wytheville, Virginia. This is a picture of her on the back porch of the family house where she was in charge of caring for her grandmother's canaries, which she absolutely hated. But her grandmother was formidable, terrifying in some ways. And Edith was the sixth of 9 children, 7 of 11 born, 6 of 9 surviving. So she was in the middle of a pack of this big family that had come down in the world after the Civil War. They had lost their plantation and moved to this storefront in Wytheville, Virginia. And she was this grandmother's favorite. And so even though she didn't have a lot of formal schooling, which was not unusual for a woman of her class and status and time period, she was educated. She wasn't some bumpkin. And her grandmother Bowling, her father's mother, very much taught her to trust her own confidence and trust her own gut, and bolstered this idea that she was capable and that she was independent. There was a conflicting message from her other grandmother and her mother herself, who were deep into the cult of true womanhood about, don't let your back hit the back of the chair and be submissive and pious at all times. So Edith, I think a lot of the conflict we see later is that she was actually this confident, strong person her grandmother Bowling believed her to be, but she had to pretend she was this feminine helpmeet that her mother wanted her to be. And that's, I think, without psychoanalyzing her too much, the underlying story of Edith a lot. So she's in Wytheville. She goes to school twice. Neither was a huge success. After her second year of school, she wanted to go back, but at that point, she had 3 younger brothers who were due to go to school, and there wasn't enough money to educate a daughter. So she goes to Washington. Here, I'm sitting in Washington, D.C. right now, because one of her older sisters had married a man named Alexander Galt. So she gets to Washington in 1890, and 1890 Washington was Gilded Age booming. It was a really interesting place to reinvent yourself if that's what you wanted to do. And she did. So she didn't have any money, but she had social status, and she had enough of a sort of veneer of sophistication that she was at the opera all the time, and she met interesting people, and she learned to be fashionable, and she became what she thought she wanted to be. And she ended up marrying a man named Norman Galt, her sister's husband's cousin. Next picture, please. This picture is from this time period. I love this picture because she's so confident. She's so beautiful. She's so just owning who she is. And I think and this is from the 1890s. This is Edith becoming herself, getting out of her little Appalachian town and becoming herself on her own to a large degree. As Mary said, if she were a man, this would be a very different story, including the up by your bootstraps, American dream that she would have been given credit for if she were a man. So she's shown that she can grab an opportunity. She's shown that she can be sophisticated. She marries Norman Galt. It is not a love story for the ages. He is her ticket out of Wytheville. He is secure. He, in his own sort of fuss budget way, adores her, but she thinks he'll do just fine. And they have a nice life here in Washington. They have one child who doesn't survive for more than 3 days, and then no more children. And she becomes a sort of woman about town. Next picture. She becomes the first woman in Washington to get a driver's license. She tooled about town in what she called her electric runabout. This is sort of a golf cart with a tiller. It top speed of about 13 miles an hour, but it was a symbol of independence. And she, with her fabulous hat, she was always beautifully dressed, would tool around town. The traffic cops knew her. And she, other Washington hostesses knew her. She was a person, and she had made that of herself. And then when Norman died, she inherited his jewelry business. So next slide. He ran Galt's, which was sort of the Tiffany of Washington. It was this high-end jewelry and silver business. And throughout Washington history, presidents and society hostesses and rich people had bought their silver and jewelry and commemorative plaques from Galt's. It had been really a place that marked the passage of society Washington. And Edith inherits it completely in the early part of the 20th century, which was still unusual. Married Women's Property Acts hadn't been around for that long. But the fact that she didn't have children and Norman's only brother was an invalid, there wasn't really sort of a man who could have contested it and made a play for the business. And the business was profitable, but when Edith inherited it, there was some debt because Norman had bought out his partners and he hadn't yet paid off that investment. So she struggled with, do I sell it? Do I bring on a partner? What do I do? And she decides to keep the business and run it. She, of course, had plenty of help. She didn't run it single-handedly, but this is a woman who just decides, I can do this. I can do this on my own. I can make this work. I can learn what I need to learn. And I don't care that I don't see a whole lot of other women business owners. I don't care that I don't have a college degree. I'm just going to make this work. And she did. And then her father died, and it became vital that she had this business because she became the cornerstone of her whole enormous family. Her three younger brothers all worked at Galt's. Her older sister, Bertha, and her mother, a widowed mother, moved to Washington, and they all support Bertha and Mrs. Bowling. And it's all on Edith. It's not on her older brothers. It's not some of whom were doing quite well. She takes on this role of supporting everybody, helping everybody. And she really relishes it. She really enjoys being the person that everyone depends on. So she's already shown us that she's incredibly confident, that she can walk into any situation and just sort of trust her, instincts to get on through, that she's willing to reinvent herself if that's what it takes, and that she really isn't going to wait for permission from anybody to do what she thinks is necessary for herself, and that she cares fiercely about the people that she loves, especially family. So she's this wealthy woman about town. She doesn't have to answer to anybody. This is a unique position in early 20th century America. She doesn't have children. She doesn't have a husband. She doesn't need a chaperone. She has means. She can do whatever she wants at a time and place when women could not do whatever they wanted. She travels. She becomes a fashion plate. When she describes this era in her memoir, she definitely kind of shades the truth in this too. She describes a European trip with her sister Bertha. She neglects to mention there were two men along on that trip too, that the whole thing was kind of an extended double date. She's curating who she was at the time. And this is the moment when she meets Woodrow Wilson. And their letters back and forth are amazing. First of all, they're really racy, or at least his are often racy. He's saying, you're so beautiful and wonderful, and I want to kiss your eyelids. She's saying, are you really going to fire William Jennings Bryan? Tell me what's going on in Mexico. Have you written a response to the Germans about the Lusitania? She's asking him to get much more involved in his work. And he is waxing eloquent about her beautiful form and, how much he wants to kiss her on the dear lounge in the house, whatever. And she's writing back saying, I really want to know what you're working on. And finally, she says that outright. She says, I love all your romantic letters, any woman would, but what I really like is when you tell me what you're working on, because then I feel I'm right there with you. And he finally takes the hint and he starts sending her huge packets of correspondence and legislation so that she can keep up with what he's doing. And she always claimed to not be political, which is just sort of laughable, but she is really interested and she's really smart. And she really wants him to value her for her brain, not just her looks. And as Mary mentioned, Wilson was a man who very much depended on the counsel of women, especially a few women very close to him. And so he's desperate for her to play that role. And so when he has his stroke in one more chapter where she telegraphs what she's doing. Next slide. During the negotiations over the Treaty of Versailles, they both go to Paris, unprecedented. No president had been gone more than, to the Panama Canal to check on the progress. No first lady had gone out of the country while in office ever. And they were in Paris for the better part of 6 months. She is not there as a plus one. She's right there in all the pictures with the Queen of England, with the leaders of European nations. She elevates the role of First Lady on an international stage. And Wilson is sort of shy and self-conscious enough that he doesn't like walking into situations where he doesn't really know what to do and what the protocol is. She's happy to do all that. She'll wander on in and ask her, do we wear gloves with dinner? How do I address so-and-so? She speaks very eccentric French because her grandmother Bowling taught it to her, and her grandmother was self-taught, so her pronunciations are all off. But Edith doesn't mind. She's happy to just barrel all in there and do what needs to be done because she's so charming and so delightful, and people really respond to her. And the press of that visit, she just is absolutely adored. And you'll hear more about Edith and the press in a minute. But so we now see that this is a woman who is smart, confident, willing to hide the truth if that's useful to her, fiercely, fiercely loyal to the people she loves, and willing to wander on into a situation she knows very little about, whether it's running a jewelry store or being the first lady, and just trust herself to figure it out on the fly. And so when Wilson collapses from a stroke in October of 1919, the fact that she chooses to do all of those things shouldn't be a surprise to anybody. She chooses to hide his illness from the public. She chooses to protect him at all costs. She said overtly, I was fighting for my husband first, and then the president of the United States. She decides that she can figure out what legislation he needs to see. She can make the decisions about what needs to go to him and what doesn't. There's huge stacks of unopened mail discovered years later at the archives, just stuff she decided to ignore, which of course has its own consequences. And so she telegraphed who she was, and she was fascinating and really smart and really complicated. And that's why I am delighted that she's kind of getting her due as a real three-dimensional person. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating. Wonderful pictures and a great discussion. So now it is my turn to introduce our last, but certainly not least, speaker, Stacy Cordery. And I also would like to invite everyone to participate in the email First Ladies 2021, that's First Ladies 2021 at gmail.com. So write an email. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us, and thank you to everyone who made this possible. My task today was to speak about Edith Wilson and the press. So I would like to begin by suggesting that when Edith became First Lady in 1915, I don't think we can assume that she knew a great deal about what that meant. She wrote in her memoir that politics was not her métier, and that when she met Wilson, she had to bone up on her understanding of government. Today, incoming first spouses can study the history of first ladies, and in fact, most do apparently, in order to help them understand how to take best advantage of this unique position, lacking in a job description beyond social expectations and tradition. Given Edith Wilson's lack of interest in politics, the relatively short time between when she met and married President Wilson, the lack of available resources beyond First Lady's memoirs, it is highly unlikely that she knew much about how former First Ladies dealt with the oftentimes crushing presence and expectations of the press. For example, she probably did not know that Lucretia Garfield, back in 1881, gave an interview to the press on a political topic. Instead, Edith Wilson's Southern upbringing, her position as the widow of a prestigious Washington store owner, plus the gendered expectations of the progressive era, governed her relationship to the press, which, as we know, did not end so well. But I don't think it necessarily began all that well either. As news leaked out that the widow Galt and the president were getting serious, whispers went around Washington. But it was not until the engagement was finally announced in the fall of 1915 that newspaper reporters pounced. Every first lady complains about the omnipresence of the media, the swift catapult to fame, and the concomitant loss of privacy. Edith Wilson felt that way too. When the notice of the official engagement was published, she called it that day of readjustment to a new life. It would have taken her less than 24 hours to know firsthand that she had zero control over what the press wrote about her. There, in front of you are descriptions of Edith Galt from the earliest newspaper coverage following the announcement of her engagement. She is just past 40. It didn't matter that she was actually 43 at the time. It was really nervy of the newspapers to print any age at all. And in fact, within days, they will revise downward her age and start to call her 38 years old. She is by no means small. This was another way to say what they often said, which is she was plump. She bears a striking resemblance to the first Mrs. Wilson. Ouch, just ouch. She has an unusual character. What does that even mean? Mrs. Galt was considered beautiful when a young girl. But what about today? She has simple tastes. She likes baseball, although she doesn't really understand it very well, and she's not a society leader. Well, there were certainly many nice things said about her too, but these likely stung and may not have given her a warm and fuzzy feeling about the press, which may have been the genesis of this from the Washington Post. There fell on her the glare of the searchlight of the nation, and she is shrinking from it like a child afraid of a storm. When she encountered journalists, she smiled a lot, she bowed to them, she waved her bouquets at them, she appeared friendly, but she depended upon an old understanding that women were private people, as opposed to men who were public people. This meant that she did not expect the press to ask her opinion, nor did she believe she should give it. But times were changing, and there were a goodly number of women active in causes, especially suffrage, who did want to be quoted by the newspapers, but not Mrs. Galt. Early on, she said, "I am of no importance, and the less the newspapers print about me at the present time, the more I will appreciate their kindness to me, and so I am sure will the president." And apparently, the Wilsons were serious, because during their honeymoon, this sentence appeared in the Washington Post. "Warning has been given today that publication of snapshots secured of the president and Mrs. Wilson would be punished by abrogation of White House privileges." As we know, Edith, once married to Woodrow, fiercely protected his health. This is partly why she accompanied him when he traveled. And when she did so, of course, the press covered her dress, her actions, and in an elaborate exercise in semiotics, tried to read her for what they could glean about the president. She did travel with him many places, both before and after the United States became involved in World War I. So much so that she was, according to the Washington Post, a more constant companion to the president than the wife of any chief executive hitherto. She was always with him, golfing nearly every morning, driving together every afternoon, attending the theater several times a week. The first couple reviewed preparedness parades and the Pan American celebration. They laid cornerstones and wreaths. They attended official events together. This was all part of her taking care of Wilson's health, which was a natural and expected part of being a wife in that era. She received positive press coverage for what the newspapers called First Lady Firsts, standing beside the president while he took the oath of office, riding with him to the Capitol and during the 1916 inaugural parade. In another First Lady First, she attended press club dinners in New York and Chicago with the president. When she took to the campaign trail along Wilson in 1916, no journalist complained. They were used to seeing the pair together. When the United States joined the First World War, Edith Wilson made admiring headlines for her Red Cross work, sewing sheets and pajamas, standing at the president's side to review a Red Cross parade or attend a Red Cross ball. There was also really good press for her autographing a baseball, which was auctioned off to support the Red Cross, although I have to tell you that the First Lady's baseball only garnered $1,400 and the president's got over $5,000. She was praised also for letting sheep graze on the White House grounds so they could be shorn and their fleece auctioned off to help the Red Cross. Being a constant companion included her going overseas with Wilson as he took upon himself the peace treaty negotiations. She was only the third First Lady to leave the country in her role and the first one to go to Europe. She was much lauded for her appropriate wartime frugality regarding what she spent on her gowns and for taking gowns made in America with her. And then once in Europe for visiting American soldiers in the Red Cross hospitals and blind soldiers in the American hospital in Paris, for distributing sweets to Parisian orphans, for presenting flowers to American canteen workers in France, and for meeting with European royalty on an equal footing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, it would have been unpatriotic to print much of anything bad about the First Lady during that long and important trip. Overall, and despite an imperfect beginning, it is fair to say that Edith Wilson's press coverage was extremely positive. Journalists kept to their unspoken bargain of the era, not insisting on interviews, not quoting her, focusing their stories on her good works and her role as Wilson's constant companion. And she kept to hers. She did not expect to be interviewed or quoted, and she was gracious as she accompanied the president. At no point did she step out of that decade's traditional gendered role. She had no cause as First Lady beyond her husband, and she never sought the spotlight nor used her position as a bully pulpit. It's when the Wilsons returned to the United States and embarked upon a trip to drum up support for the Treaty of Versailles in September of 1919 that Edith Wilson's relationship with the press began to diminish. But it did so because it was connected to the role she had always played, a private and constant companion who guarded her husband's health. After his health failed on that Western trip, the First Lady remained silent about his initial collapse. As Wilson's doctor suggested, they returned to Washington early. There, Wilson suffered a severe stroke, which left him partially paralyzed. Edith Wilson then made a series of other decisions that were controversial in that day and remain so today. She made the decision that he should not resign, even when his illness lengthened from days to weeks to months. She kept silent about the gravity of his illness, telling neither the public, nor Congress, nor even Wilson himself. She decided not to tell the press much at all about the status of the president's health, and when it had to be mentioned, it must be minimized. As his constant companion, solely on the lookout for what was best for him, she felt she was doing the right thing and was unapologetic about it in her memoir. She never broke out of that gendered traditional relationship with the press. She was not a suffragist. She was not used to speaking to reporters, despite the very clear fact that she was dealing with an emergency of enormous proportions and global impact. She did not step across that private-public line. She did not provide updates on Wilson's health and consistently treated his condition as though it were only a private issue. This, after she'd stood next to him as he had been feted and awarded and fawned over by Europe. It's not like she, who had been with him every step of the way, didn't know his international status and importance. Edith Wilson's insistence to keep him and all Americans, indeed all the world, in the dark was what Wilson's biographer, John Milton Cooper, labeled a cover-up. According to Edith's biographer, Christy Miller, Wilson's declining health caused behavioral disturbances that would have huge implications in the League of Nations. Now, I am not an apologist for Edith Wilson, but her not engaging with or speaking to the press was completely in keeping with how she had dealt with the press from the very beginning. Why should she change? Well, of course, the reason to change is because it was absolutely an emergency situation. Prioritizing her husband's health over the country's welfare and her reluctance to speak out have been interpreted as a power grab. It was, at the very least, a terrible series of decisions for the country. Christy Miller found that Edith Wilson's actions had a long reach, influencing even the 1967 passage of the 25th Amendment, dictating that the vice president and no one else will govern if the president is incapacitated. Why? Why did Edith Wilson lie to the press? To conclude, I will suggest 3 reasons, although there are undoubtedly more. First, Edith and Woodrow Wilson were products of their times. A lady did not engage with the third estate. Second, unlike other first couples, Edith did not have the deep understanding of politics that nearly all other first ladies had by virtue of a long marriage and a shared political march toward the White House. Edith knew arguably less than any other first lady except young Frances Cleveland, because Edith had been married to Wilson only 3 years and 7 months before his illness began. Third, Edith and Woodrow married late in life and for the second time, and they were still pretty much in their honeymoon phase. Her focus never wavered from protecting him. The repercussions from her decisions touch how we view the sphere of action of the First Lady and act as a warning to every First Lady down to our own day. Power and the First Lady have been an uncomfortable pairing ever since Edith Wilson. Of course, First Ladies are neither elected nor appointed, but many Americans are made uncomfortable by the proximity of family members to the president. While he, the president, is grateful for the support of family members that he can trust, and ideally who can and will tell him honestly when something he's contemplating is a bad idea, it is simultaneously true that those same family members have the most to protect, the most to lose, the most reasons to forego transparency, and the greatest likelihood of making terrible decisions, even if out of an abundance of love. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stacy. Such a set of enlightening and really enjoyable presentations. We have a whole new, I think, sense of Edith Wilson, thanks to the wonderful research of our speakers tonight. And I'm looking forward to your thoughts. Those of you who are listening with us tonight, if you would like to send in your questions, if you haven't already, we have, well, just about 10 minutes. We would absolutely love to entertain them. And of course, we will also probably have some questions amongst ourselves. So I would love to hear if there are any questions. We would certainly like to consider them for the speakers.
Hold on a second. I think I have a text message.
Shall I ask a question while you're looking for that, Nancy?
No, actually, I will ask a question if you will allow me, which is historians say that because Edith controlled access to Woodrow Wilson, she didn't really allow the vice president to have much access to Wilson, that she facilitated the defeat of the League of Nations. And I am interested in the panelists' thoughts. Is that an unfair assessment, or how do you feel about that?
I think it is, because I think the cards were stacked against Wilson. And you can't just look at Wilson, what she did. Again, and as I see her in her role as chief of staff, she told the vice president, you know, you're pretty much the hostess now. You and your wife can take over that function, and I will do the rest. But in my opinion, the Treaty of Versailles League of Nations was going down, no matter what. It was the question of I think Lodge leading both Republican supporters in lockstep, and also ultra progressive Democrats who are tired of war and violence. And it was going down, and he had lost the whole Congress. It had gone Republican. I think Wilson takes a chance, and Edith Wilson supports it in it, that if you are so strong, maybe you'll break the opposition. But I think the tide was turning against him, the progressive movement, America on the world stage. And she even told him, though, but she stepped in and said, I think you should compromise. It was one time she came forward and said, I think you should. The more I study it, the era that's coming, and the kind of the continuing battle between Lodge and his philosophy, which will dominate much of the 20s, and Wilson, I don't think it would have, I don't think it was totally his fault. I don't think it would have passed. That's my considered opinion after studying this for so many years.
I totally agree with Mary, but also, to be fair, the vice president wanted no part of it. The vice president was Thomas Marshall. He was put on the ticket to get the Electoral College votes of Indiana. He was a little bit of a clown. He, was great with a one-liner. He was super charming at parties. He wanted no part of the presidency, and he certainly wanted no part of being seen as a usurper. And before the 25th Amendment, when it was so muddy about what happened with an incapacitated president, he was in danger of being seen as taking power that he was not entitled to. And so he made it clear from the very beginning that he, let me know if he really is at death's door and I'm going to need to take over the presidency, please keep me in the loop. And they weren't great about that because they thought he was a clown. But it's not like Thomas Marshall was stepping up and saying, give me the responsibility, I'll take it on.
Yeah, just to buttress that point, remember Theodore Roosevelt, who, was chomping at the bit to be president from a fairly young age. When McKinley was assassinated, he was scarce. He didn't appear in Buffalo until, the president was at death's door. So the vice president in Wilson's administration had a tough road to hoe in that way.
I always say, if I could write about these three men, not FDR, Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, and Henry Cabot Lodge. I know it's very operatic and dramatic, but I'd call it something like Goddammer and Twilight of the Gods. This was a colossal battle in American history. And I hope now, with the suffering in Ukraine, we understand that it wasn't just isolated into 1916, 18, 19, 20. It's a battle of what's America's role on the world stage. And Wilson has made that colossal jump to, we've got to get out there. It sounds so tinny, make the world safe for democracy, but it's happening right now in Ukraine. And there was a great movement in American history not to go in that direction, that he was wrong, that he had gone way past what an American president should do. And that's the Lodge end of things, but it was a colossal battle. And I keep thinking of that great story. I know both my fellow historians must know this, that when John Singer Sargent comes into the White House to do the painting of Wilson, and he's entertained by Edith and Woodrow, and they say, what's wrong with him? He's acting like crazy. And then he has been sent in by Henry Cabot Lodge to paint something demonic and animal-like in Wilson's portrait. And he goes back to Lodge and he goes, there's nothing animal-like or dark or evil about this man. But that's the level of visceral hatred on all sides in this. We certainly, as grown women, have seen visceral hatreds of presidents.
I'm going to jump in here if I may.
Classic period.
Thank you. I just want to be sure that if we had any questions from the audience, we could hear those. Nancy, has anyone?
I do have one.
And I also just wanted to mention before you go on that if people are, because I know we're running close on time, if people are interested in learning more about Edith and about other Southern First Ladies, this book is a wonderful resource, and several of our panelists are involved with it. So I hope very much you will consider. It's probably backwards, isn't it? But anyway, thank you. No, good.
A question that we have is, to what extent have changing ideas about women over the course of the past 100 years shaped or reshaped our view of Edith Wilson?
That's a really interesting question. I think that there's a couple of things there. I think that we're more willing to admire her ambition rather than downplay her ambition. But I also think that in general, and I applaud this movement, we are all getting away from the Hall of Fame model of history, right? That there's just this hagiography of the great and the good, which first of all is very male-centric because they were the ones who were able to hold the offices that, let you into the Hall of Fame. But also it's really bad history, I mean, thinking of these people as saints, plus it's kind of boring. Saints are boring. So I think that the idea of a flawed, complicated, maybe well-intentioned, but making bad mistakes with large consequences is a story we want to hear more of. And we're less driven to just put our historical figures up on pedestals. I hope that's the case.
And can I say quickly, I don't know if things have changed that much. I still see female leaders. I think of Nancy Pelosi pummeled and not given the credit she's due. She does more than anybody else, and she's at the bottom of the heap always. I'm right across the border from Governor Whitmer, where we've got militia men trying to murder her. She's a tremendous leader. There's still a dark caste in American thinking that women can't be leaders, and we have to still be somehow feminine, good, and sweet. And I think it haunts all of us to this day. And until I had started thinking about Edith Wilson, I didn't realize how much it impacts all of us. I hope it's changing. I hope it changes in the next 100 years.
I just wanted to bring up something. May I ask a question, Nancy? Is there time?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. To kind of build on what you've both been saying, you've all been saying, and I'd love to hear what you have to say about this, all of our panelists. But you had alluded to this briefly, Mary, in your presentation. And I think, Rebecca, what you were saying as well builds on this, which is looking at these first ladies, not necessarily in a hagiographic way, but looking at them, as a complicated people. And I've certainly seen that with Florence Harding. She was definitely had some flaws, as people do. But one of the issues that came up, one of the issues that came up was, of course, the background, and you have all alluded to this, of Edith as a Southern woman, and of course she rushed as a girl to teenager to the Robert E. Lee statue being raised in Richmond, and of course she continued to have really problematic views her whole life. So I wondered if anyone wanted to comment on that, because this is obviously a topic that's very much in our minds. And I appreciate, Mary, what you said, that certainly that's not all that she is, but it's a piece. And I think it would be, I'd love to hear, maybe start with you, if we could, Stacy, what you think about that in this moment, and anyone else, Rebecca, of course, Mary, anyone's welcome to join in.
You know me, I'll be quiet until you tell me to talk.
Stacy, you're muted.
Sorry. Yeah, no, and I'm unmuting only to say that I don't have a lot to say on this topic. There's about those relations. So go ahead, Rebecca, Mary.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that not only was she a Southern woman, she was a Southern woman who was raised during Reconstruction. And I think that is vital to understanding who she was. So her family was plantation, slave owning. They were descended from Pocahontas. They were the first families of Virginia. They were that James River Basin wealthy planters. And then when they lost the Civil War and they had to pay their labor, they lost their plantation and they came down in the world. So not only did she have a Southern sensibility in terms of how she was raised and these lost cause narratives that she was absolutely raised with, but she believed that she deserved a different childhood than she had. And that comes very clear in her memoir. And so it's not just the region, it is the time as well. You cringe at her description of how the happy slaves were, well taken care of, and how distraught they were after they were freed. And and she wrote her memoir in 1938, right? So she was a rebel Confederate in sensibility till the very end.
And one thing that surprised me about her, and this is something we have to remember, in her time period, the three hated groups, Catholics and Jews. She hated Catholics. That's another Southern thing. We now think white people are all happy together. No, they weren't. There were kinds of white. She was the good white. The way you just described her, coming from that English Anglo-Saxon purity, she cannot contain her dislike of the Catholic Church. She hates tumulty. She hates all these Irish Catholics Wilson has brought into its administration. She doesn't like the Irish Catholic Secret Service men. She will not go meet the Pope. She said, I'm not meeting the Pope. She laughs at the French and the Belgian soldiers with their ruined faces. She is taken around to all these Catholic cathedrals that are destroyed. And she just shakes her head. She doesn't care. But she has to change. She has to change because Wilson helps the Catholics in Central Europe, the Jews in Catholic Central and Southern Europe. He helps Armenians. He helps everybody. And after he dies and she's exhausted, she goes to a great Catholic monument. She goes over to Mont Saint Michel. Like, I got to get something back. And she'll spend much of the rest of her life talking to Poles and Czechs. I'm Irish on one side. I'm a Pole and Czech on the other. They love Wilson to this day. And she had to go listen to all these Catholic people who loved him for saving their nation.
And to her credit, she came around to Al Smith's candidacy in 1928. She wrote about how she thought that the anti-Catholicism against him was bigoted and unfair. So, you know, she did evolve.
He evolves, but that was like, it's so terrible to say Blacks were hated, Jews were hated, Catholics were hated. Hatred always is so much wider than just one group. And I think that's, by the end of her memoir, I'm like going, I got to put this down. And then I realized just how you described it, that world she came out of, Catholics were hated. And she had to grow out of that. The way Wilson had to grow out of hating Catholics, bringing Catholics and Jews into his administration. And too bad he took that backward step on segregating Washington, D.C.
Well, and that's what's interesting to me is the relationship between the First Lady and the President, who influences who, and which way does it go? So what role does Edith's upbringing, as Rebecca and you, Mary, have described it, play in Wilson's own actions in allowing, for example, the resegregation of Washington, D.C.? This is why I like studying both parts of the couple to see how that happens.
What a question, because I keep saying to myself, was it Edith or was it McAdoo?
Well, I think it started with Ellen, didn't it?
Let's not forget
Ellen. I mean, the policy started before Edith, so I don't know if we can blame her for that.
Go to the Wilson House in Washington, D.C. There's a wonderful lady who does a wonderful tour, and she's struggling with all these questions. And I took the tour in October. She's stunning. So go there. They're doing all the displays on Edith and racism and stuff. And
Thank you. These are wonderful recommendations.
I'm still thinking about this stuff.
Wonderful. Nancy, do we need to wrap things up, or?
I do. It has been a wonderful panel, and I know I so enjoyed it and learned so much. And she is such a divisive person in terms of how people feel about her, and I think that you helped set the record straight. Please join us for the next FLAIR program, which is April 14th, 2022 at 7 Eastern Time. And it's called She Did It All That. She Did All That, Betty Ford Speaking Out, Saving Lives, which will be a conversation with the playwright, director, and producer, Lisa Rafferty, who will discuss her work in creating this play. So that should be a lot of fun. And I want to thank all of the panelists. I think you did an outstanding job, and I'm just very, very pleased. And I look forward to our next FLAIR panel. So thank you all
so much. Thank you all for coming and being part of this wonderful panel. I learned so much. Thanks again.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.